All right, thank you all for coming today. And we're here today in the midst of a leadership vacuum across all fronts. And we want to propose a response to President Biden's recent supplemental request. The president has requested additional funding for Ukraine, funding for Israel, and funding for our southern border. Standing here today are members who support all three efforts. There's a lot more of us who also support this plan and this strategy. I would say a majority of the conference. So we present our goals today in good faith and with shared goals. We must see the defeat of Russia. We must see the defeat of Hamas. But we can't move an inch on additional funding until we have passed meaningful border security for our own southern border and received critical answers to questions on Ukraine from the White House. Today, we see that the president has focused in on Ukraine and border and linked those two things. That's good. It means that he understands that no more Ukraine aid can happen without a southern border strategy, a meaningful one. Now, of course, you might imagine there's actually some disagreement on what meaningful border security is. And so we're going to answer those questions today. First, what constitutes meaningful border security and effective border policy reforms? And second, what the nature of Ukraine aid needs to be moving forward. So let's briefly outline our position. And I think this has to be the basis of any further discussions with the White House and Senate. First, meaningful border security must include proposals in H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act. It was passed by the House earlier this year. While I don't dispute the funding request for DHS operations requested by the president, there's simply not enough. The crisis at our southern border is not one that can be resolved with more money. Policy must change. The funding requests might be needed, but they would only serve to facilitate the current crisis as opposed to stop it. The goal should not be a more orderly crisis, but a stop to the crisis altogether. And that means we have to stop the magnets that have drawn in millions and millions of illegal immigrants. That magnet is very simple. It is a belief that if you cross our border illegally, there's a very good chance that you'll get to stay. Until that changes, people will continue to flood our border. H.R. 2 changes that incentive by reforming our asylum laws to work as intended, to be used for people who are truly persecuted. The abuse of that goodwill is the number one reason that there is a crisis, and it must be reformed for meaningful border security to be achieved. Beyond that, we have to authorize and require that asylum be applied for within the country of origin, at a U.S. embassy or U.S. consulate or a third country nearby. We must provide the resources to do so. This is a common sense step that I know even many Democrats support. All of this would have massive ramifications in reducing illegal crossings at our border. Now, last, we actually must provide the resources for additional detention facilities both here and in Mexico and require that they actually be used. The era of the illegal parole program, catch and release, has to end. Our system should be very simple. If you cross illegally, you're detained until your asylum case can be heard. And the simple act of applying for asylum, even if you do it on the CBP app, cannot therefore mean that you are granted parole within the U.S. If millions of people around the world have to wait years and years and years for a visa to visit the United States, a person at our border should be no different. The asylum process was never intended to be a shortcut. So these are red lines on meaningful border security. There are many bills, some of which are bipartisan, that achieve these goals. We need to start detailed discussions with the White House and with the Senate immediately. I'll let my friend Mike Garcia speak in more detail on how we plan to reshape policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. He's put considerable thought into this, and I'll summarize it. America's role should be defeating Russia and defining what defeat is. The administration must be on Capitol Hill every day for the next 2 months, explaining their strategy and how they plan to execute it. These briefings can be classified in nature to avoid revealing our intentions to the enemy. But second, we cannot fund additional economic aid for Ukraine. We must be focused on advanced weaponry that will break the stalemate and make Vladimir Putin regret his decision to engage in the largest war of conquest since World War II. While we understand the importance of keeping the Ukrainian economy afloat, our voters and our taxpayers simply won't accept it anymore. And that fact is not going to change anytime soon. The Europeans Arab countries, Asian countries must step up on humanitarian and economic aid. Last and more important, any further aid must be tied to a winning strategy. This administration has slow-dripped weaponry and capabilities to Ukraine out of fear that Putin might escalate. And in doing so, has prolonged this war and likely missed opportunities to make consequential gains on the battlefield that may have resulted in peace talks. We must identify weapons systems that will make a difference and deploy them with haste. There are some in our party who don't care about defeating Russia. We are not among them. We understand this isn't about Ukraine necessarily and specifically, but about maintaining America's deterrence for the next 100 years against our adversaries. In this group that have helped draft these ideas are veterans, lawmakers who have fought in the real world, who have been briefed at the highest levels about the threats we face. We understand that peace through strength only works if you have the guts to use your strength. And self-deterrence has, and always will, invite more aggression. That's the lesson of history time and time again. So we have an opportunity here for a grand bargain. We have an opportunity to put forward a package that secures our southern border once and for all and secures American leadership and deterrence against our adversaries. If we come together under the policies that I've outlined, America cannot lose. I don't believe that we are so divided on these issues, and I ask that the President begin discussions with us as soon as possible. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Representative Garcia.
Well, I want to thank Crenshaw for leading this presser, pulling us together to have some very important conversations that frankly aren't being had right now. He mentioned the policy issues on the border and the fact that we need to put our border as a priority over the borders of other nations first. I think that's a very important conversation. I want to dive a little deeper specifically into the Ukraine funding debate. There seems to be two islands right now. There's an island that says we will do whatever it takes, sort of a blank check mentality that this president has adopted. And another island that is basically stating not a dollar more, not a dime more in support of Ukraine. I think there's a place in the middle that allows us to still defeat Russia, make sure that we secure Ukraine, but also focusing on the priorities like our border and not at the expense of those things. I think it's important to note that any war effort funded by American taxpayers should have the support and understanding not only of the taxpayers, but also of the representatives in Congress who work for those taxpayers. A lack of transparency and accountability by the executive branch, combined with an absence of a coherent win strategy and a path to peace, is the forcing function for what I see as an erosion of support against an endless funding that we're seeing both in Congress and among the American people. They're getting tired of this endless funding stream. The current stalemate on the ground in Ukraine is undeniable. At the same time, President Biden expects an indefinite increase in financial support from Congress for the war effort with no outlined strategy for eventual peace. This should alarm all of us. The whatever it takes mentality seems to include negatively impacting our own capacity and our own readiness challenges. Amid an ongoing war in Israel now and in the shadow of the CCP aggression and what looks like an imminent threat in the South China Sea, our own capacity and our own readiness are dangerous trade-offs that we are making in support of Ukraine. Russia is like that slow, high snowball that you throw in a fight to distract folks. While they're looking up at that slow, high snowball, the other kid throws that line drive to the forehead. And China, in this case, the CCP, is that line drive to the forehead in terms of our own nation's security. The U.S. should decouple humanitarian aid and remove any funding that subsidizes Ukrainian government officials and workers. If we're to effectively support the war effort moving forward, American scope should make sure that our involvement is only to that of defeating Russians on the front lines. That means providing the necessary weapon systems and tactics to win, not to tie, but to win. If we continue to blend and dilute the military aid with humanitarian aid, we're not going to be supporting a victory. We're enabling a dependency on American taxpayers, and we're enabling a tie on the battlefield. I predict a few future strategic errors that will be aggravated by a trail of already realized strategic errors by this administration. The patterns of the administration under Biden's strategic errors combined with Russia's proclivity to engage in protracted wars and the Biden administration's inability to understand these strategic implications is basically buying us a long-term stalemate. They're harbingers of a costly and potentially escalated conflict with Russia, riddled with future strategic errors as well. And any responsible legislator right now on both sides of the aisle must be asking smart and reasonable questions today before supporting more taxpayer aid to Ukraine. Any well-intentioned leader in the White House should also be chomping at the bit to answer these questions from Congress. I see not a willingness to not answer these questions as a red flag out of this administration. So let's cover some of the questions that need to be answered from this administration, as well as President Zelensky in some cases. Both President Biden and President Zelensky must provide the U.S. Congress with an actual win strategy. Simply stating that we are with you until we prevail, or we must win, are actually not win strategies. How does Ukraine prevail, and how long is this expected to take? These estimates don't need to be exact, but we should understand the end state goal, and we should understand the exit criteria as well as a price tag associated with that win. President Biden and Secretary of Defense Austin need to clearly update the American people on the status of the war and the war front in Ukraine. This includes informing the public on the Ukrainian progress to date, the progress of the spring offensive that seems to be stalled out, outlining causal factors for the current stalemate, and providing a status update on the spring counteroffensive moving forward. President Biden and Secretary Austin must explain why the U.S. investments are necessary. This includes outlining which weapons are being sent and how those specific weapons will help win the war, not just prolong it. Also, it's important to get an assessment of which weapons have not been sent but could have altered the trajectory of the war if they had been sent before today. President Biden and Secretary Austin should provide Congress with a list of weapons that have not been sent but would be effective in altering the current stalemate. This administration's current slow drip policy that Dan Crenshaw outlined has a prolonged effect of hurting Ukraine in the long run rather than helping them, and it's the responsibility of Congress to play a role in deciding what additional capabilities should be offered to Ukraine. President Biden and Secretary Austin must explain what would happen if American investments into Ukraine cease. Do we believe EU and NATO nations would also divest from the efforts? Would Ukraine not be able to survive and win? If not, why? What core military exports would absolutely be necessary to enable that win? The U.S. Treasury and Commerce need to report to Congress with the level of enforcement and compliance of already approved sanctions against Russia. No one is providing regular and thorough updates to Congress on these sanction fronts. The U.S. and all NATO members should also adopt a full sanction policy against Russia to include all oil, all grain, and rare earth minerals. These three critical exports are currently not meaningfully impacted by global sanctions, and they represent the bulk of export revenue to Russia. President Biden and Secretary Austin must provide a clear explanation of why resources are being requested are the right ones and are enabling the win. And also, does the U.S. and Ukraine have an alignment on mission objectives? We hear about this desire to go and reclaim Crimea by the Ukrainians. I don't think that reflects the strategies and goals of our own administration, and how do you reconcile those differences? The last two, President Biden and President Zelensky must continue to provide Congress with a full accounting to the max extent possible of weapon systems that have been sent and used to date. And last, President Biden must provide a commitment and evidence to the fact that his administration is not jeopardizing the cost and schedule of critical domestic weapon programs or commitments that we've made to our Taiwan partners with FMF programs or to our Israeli partners with FMS and FMF programs. We cannot cannibalize the capacity of our own capabilities or our strategic partners to meet the demands and commitments to Ukraine. I'll end with this. The president has also sent a veto threat to the U.S. Congress, House, and Senate that he will veto the NDAA with a specific focus and rationale for that veto being a $2 billion cost footprint to give our junior enlisted a pay raise that they deserve and is long overdue. Our current enlisted members start at $22,000 a year. My pay raise for junior enlisted would take that starting salary from $22,000 to $31,200 a year. It gets them above the poverty line, gets them off of food stamps, and this president has cited that pay increase as one of the reasons to veto the NDAA. I think if we are spending this type of money on other nations' security, we owe it to our troops to spend the $2 billion necessary to get them off of food stamps. With that, I'll yield back to my friend Dan Crenshaw.
Thanks, Mike. I would also like to bring to the podium Representative Mike Gallagher.
I'll just be very brief. I'm here today just because primarily I appreciate the spirit in which both Dan and Mike and members like Jan have tackled this. Here you have members with immense experience trying to tackle a very complicated topic and identify and forge a principled path forward, one that goes beyond talking points or political gamesmanship, but puts the interests of our country ahead of their own narrow parochial and political interests. And quite frankly, we need more of that in Congress. The plan that Mike Garcia has come out with and the questions he's asking are incredibly thoughtful, and I hope every member reads it, and I hope that that's a starting point for our path forward on Ukraine. And the work that Dan has done on the border similarly is incredibly thoughtful. And I was dismayed when I got the letter associated with the supplemental request where the administration is accusing, in their section requesting more money for the border, accusing House Republicans of playing politics with this issue on the border. That's not a productive starting point for a good faith negotiation. I would argue non-enforcement of the law and a refusal to understand the ways in which we need to reform law, like our asylum provisions, is the definition of playing politics. So I want to thank Dan and Mike for their leadership. I chair the Select Committee on China. My preoccupation is with cross-strait deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. My mission in Congress is to prevent a war with China, which would be horrific. And I think in order to do that, we need to understand why we are where we are geopolitically. I would submit to you that deterrence failed in Ukraine because we abandoned hard power. We relied solely on soft power and the vague threat of sanctions to deter. And when dealing with a dictator like Vladimir Putin, that simply is not going to work. So we need to learn those lessons and not only find the path forward on Ukraine and on the border, but apply those lessons in other theaters. And quite frankly, this should be a wake-up call to rebuild our entire arsenal of deterrence. We've just neglected it for far too long. So again, I want to thank Dan and Mike for their leadership. We need more of it. They're essential voices in Congress. And your comment about the defense appropriation, Mike, makes me think that as we think about a supplemental request, we should also pass the thing that one might want to supplement, which is a defense appropriation in the first place. And it's important that we don't hold that hostage for other political priorities or to score points in an election year. So with that, I'll stop talking. Thank you both.
Representative Jen Kagan.
Thanks so much, Dan and Mike. And I just wanted to thank you two for your leadership on this important issue and just for highlighting the supplemental request that's come down from the administration. The importance of still being partners with Ukraine, but having a very defined strategy, it's something that Representative Garcia talked about, is very important. We saw after that withdrawal from Afghanistan the chaos and the distrust that was created amongst our allies. So we have spent the time since then at regaining trust, and now is not the time to pull back and leave them in their hour of need. So I worry that our friends don't trust us and our enemies don't fear us. And I think that defining our request for Ukraine funding, this is not a blank check. There absolutely has to be accountability. I am thankful for the white paper that Representative Garcia has laid out. I think that clearly defines what we are looking for. And as far as tying it to border security, what Representative Crenshaw talked about, that is so important. When I've visited the border twice, and when you go down to the border and you talk to Border Patrol and you say, well, why are we seeing these floods of people now coming across with this change of administration? They say, well, the word is on the street. These guys know how easy it is to get into your country, and that this catch and release program, they will have years of time and probably won't have anyone follow up with them. So we've made it too easy to get in. And now we look at what's going on with Israel and the threats of Hamas and Hezbollah, and we worry even today in the news, about the people from the terrorist list coming into our country through the southern border. So border security is important now more than ever. And when you add that onto the drug trafficking and the human trafficking problems, we have got to find a way to wrap border security into any other supplemental funding, be it for Ukraine, be it for Israel, be it for Southeast Asia. The world is not a safe place. We have sent our military members in harm's way. People from my 2nd District in Virginia, we have sent 2 carrier battle groups to sit off the coast of Israel. So now is the time for those of us who have served our great nation to be loud voices and to be advocates for what our military members need. what the world needs to keep that peace. If we don't have peace, we have nothing, I always say. So, but we need some accountability for that. We look at the economic just struggles that we continue to have, and we know that so many people in Congress right now, especially on my side of the aisle, are prioritizing cutting funding. I think it's one reason that we're in the economic predicament that we're in, that we have spent too much. So how can we be responsible spenders? We want to be helpful in the world. We want to be a world power and the world leader. It's important that we maintain that role, that we are that deterrent, but we need to do it responsibly. So it's an honor to stand today with my fellow veterans to speak not only for our great military, but also to just really define some of the things that this administration needs to acknowledge. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jen. Look, last thing I'll say, this is a priority for the next speaker. It needs to be. That's why we're doing this before the speaker election. We're doing this on the heels of the Biden administration's supplemental request. We need to plant the flag that this is what has to happen. This is the kind of plan we talked about with Speaker McCarthy before he was vacated. Democrats want Ukraine aid more than Republicans want it. Republicans want border security more than Democrats want it. So we need to make a deal. That's the grand bargain. Meaningful border security and right-sized Ukraine aid. We can all win if we do that. And with that, we'll take your questions.
You said that it's a red line to have the Secure the Border Act, but the administration already said the president vetoed that when it was included with the defense appropriations surplus last month. Do you have any comment on that?
It was included in the CR, if you recall. So that can be his position. Is that still going to be his position when it's attached with Ukraine aid? You know, look, Republicans who don't want Ukraine aid are going to have to answer the question: do you want Russia to win more than you want the border secure? And then President Biden's going to have to ask: do you care more about Ukraine's border than you care about our border? The American people actually are in lockstep on this. You know, the American people, 90-10, want a secure border. They're actually like 50-50 on Ukraine aid. So if the president is not going to play ball with us on the border, he is not in lockstep with the American people and what their priorities are. This is a win-win situation if we want it to be.
Mr. Crenshaw, at the beginning you said you think that the majority of the Republican conference supports all three of those issues that you discussed. The last standalone vote on Ukraine aid, though, in the House saw a majority of the conference vote against adding it back to the state foreign ops bill. So why do you feel that way?
Well, you're going to get a lot of Republicans lost if it's just Ukraine aid. So that's the kind of vote you're talking about. But if it's if it's meaningful border security in addition to that, that's how you're going to get them on board.
So what do you see as the ratio? I mean, where's the majority of the Republican conference on Ukraine as an issue right now?
I mean, it's diminishing. That's why we're doing this. And I don't have the exact numbers for you. I'm not a whip, but there's a majority who still support it. That being said, there's questions. I mean, my friend Mike Garcia here, we support it, but we have questions. We don't like the way it's being done. So it's a little bit more nuanced than do you support it or do you not support it. There's different categories of people. But again, if we get meaningful border security out of it and we right-size the Ukraine aid, I think it's a pretty tough. It's going to be pretty tough to vote against that because our border matters that much more.
Does it bother you that so many of your fellow Republicans are resistant to Ukraine aid? I mean, you're kind of packaging it with something that they would really like, so that they would accept it, which suggests you can't actually persuade them on the merits. Is that accurate?
Some, right? There's different categories of people. Okay, there's some who are just like as Mike outlined, never again support Ukraine. They don't understand the strategic importance of that, and I can talk for hours trying to help them understand. It's not really about Ukraine, it's about Russia, and it's about stopping a world that we used to live in prior to World War II, where countries just invaded other countries and caused global chaos. Nobody really remembers that world. And that was the world humans lived in for thousands of years. It was a world of survival, not of flourishing. I don't want to live in that world. And the only way that world comes back is if America pulls back. So that's the grand understanding of why we do what we do, why we support allies. Some people don't understand that. That's okay. I'll continue to try and convince them. Does it concern me? Yes, it concerns me. But it also concerns me that the administration is not committed to this war correctly, and for all the reasons that Mike outlined. So there's a nuanced positions in between.
And how big a deal is it to you to have a speaker in this election who feels similarly with you guys about helping Ukraine and pushing back against Russia?
All the speaker candidates I've talked to agree wholeheartedly with this plan. It's going to be border and Ukraine tied together, because strategically and politically, that is the only vehicle for border security. If there's any Republican who thinks they're getting meaningful border security through the appropriations process, I'll say this, some beachfront property in Nebraska, it hasn't happened ever. We've been talking about it forever. It didn't happen when we had the Senate and White House. This is the deal. This is the deal. They want Ukraine aid bad enough. We're getting border security with it. And you know what? I think they want border security too. They just want to blame us for it. So this is the time. We all need to get on board with that plan.
Congressman, what speaker candidates have you talked to, and what assurances have they made you that they would put a package with Ukraine funding on the floor?
I'm not going to give you specifics about what they've said. I think they'll talk about that in the forum right now. But everyone I've talked to, look, this was Speaker McCarthy's plan before the vacation. Even Jim Jordan was talking about this and tying these together when he was running. This is not a controversial idea. I'm not sure anyone has a different plan at this point. You might have heard some say that all of this stuff needs to be separated. I think that's crazy. That means you definitely never get border security. That's what that would mean. I'm not sure some Republicans understand that.
Is that clear to the conference that these need to travel together?
I'm doing this to make that clear. Now, I will say this: the Israel aid, it's more non-controversial. To me, that's neutral, whether you put it in this package or not. The real discussion here is connecting the border with Ukraine aid. Do you have anything to add?
I mean, is there a single candidate in particular that you think would be the best to execute this agenda?
I'm about to go to the forum and hear him speak. I mean, I do have some ideas. I'm not ready to say it right now.
Maybe I can add I think the vast majority of our conference wants Russia to lose. They want Ukraine to win. They want to cut spending, and they want to make sure that our border is secure, right? That's the common denominator of what we're proposing here. You saw 117 people vote in our conference against what was about a $300 million aid package to Ukraine a couple of weeks ago. And you can imagine what that number looks like when we're talking about $61 billion. It's not that they don't want Russia to lose, and it's not that they don't want Ukraine to prevail. It's that they seek clarity, they seek transparency, they seek accountability, and they want to know that the money that we're spending in a time when we have $33 trillion in debt and massive deficit spending on an annual basis is actually going to pay for a victory and not guarantee a dependency on American taxpayers that ends in a stalemate. And that's what we need the answers to. That's why we are asking these questions, so that we can get to a position where we have confidence that what we are providing is a lifeline to a victory and ultimately to a defeat of Russia, okay? That is a common denominator across, I would say, 98% of our conference and across the aisle as well. So, and I would say that close to 100% of every member of Congress on both sides of the aisle want a secure border. Some are a little more squeamish in public to say that, but we recognize that this is the biggest threat to our nation's security right now. So the coupling of these two things is actually very important, and to right-size the Ukraine investment, and for folks like us to go do our due diligence to make sure that we're not doing more than what's necessary or spending money on humanitarian aid when that should be the role of the EU is the point of all this. And I think that's going to be consistent with every candidate that we hear speak tonight for the speaker's race.
And just have a quick comment about that as well. You know, we need to remember that Putin is an aggressor. He is a thug, and Russia is still our enemy, and the Ukrainians have been fighting that fight. I agree wholeheartedly with the sentiments of my colleagues, but that is our job right now, is to make sure we educate the rest of our conference, the rest of Congress, on why it's important that we have some level of involvement there. If Putin was to be successful with Ukraine, he has said he will take the Baltics next. And that means that American servicemen and women will be potentially involved in that conflict. That's not a risk that I'm willing to take at this point. We also know that the world is watching. We know that Xi is watching. We know that that Putin has been in talks with Xi and with North Korea. So they are waiting and they are watching. And any sign of weakness from us is almost a green light to those guys. So again, peace through strength. We have to be that deterrent.
What about
a longer-term immigration question with the U.S. Birth rate declining. To stay competitive over the next decades with emerging economies, is it possible the GOP sooner than later may have the opinion that we need more immigration, and that's perhaps a middle ground across the aisle?
It's too late for that. When you have you had a all-time record this month of illegal crossings. Nobody's ready to talk about immigration reform or increasing quotas, not for a long time, not until the border is actually secured, and we see that for a number of years. That's where voters are at.
So just to verify, are you comfortable with the funding levels that the administration proposed, in addition to the portions you said about the border and Ukraine? That number you support?
Not necessarily. I mean, a large portion of the Ukraine aid is economic, humanitarian aid. As I said, that should really start being provided by European countries, other countries. Look, I mean, your Arab countries has a role in this too. None of them have done it. These rich oil countries. If the Ukraine economy falls, it does have massive effects throughout the world. Not necessarily in the United States, but throughout the developing world. This will affect all of these countries. They need to come together and help out. We can provide the exquisite weaponry necessary to actually change the stalemate. That should be our goal. So no, I don't. So there needs to be a lot of details fleshed out in the funding levels themselves. On the DHS funding levels, more details needed. They tend to go to the right places, but right now, the way their policies are, that would simply facilitate the current crisis. It would make it cleaner. It doesn't need to be cleaner, it needs to be stopped. And so you have to add the policy changes in addition to those funding mechanisms.
Why did the majority of the conference vote against the creation of a new IG, a coordinating IG, in that $300 million package?
The question was,
there was a special new inspector general in that training package of $300 million to coordinate the work of the other IGs for oversee Ukraine aid. But a majority of the conference voted against that.
Yeah, well, because there's a debate over whether that's necessary. There's already a lot of money and a lot of IG support for Ukraine. I help educate members a lot on this particular issue. If the Ukrainians want an additional Javelin missile, for instance, they have an entire process where they have to take pictures of the spent rounds and get it back. It's very, very difficult for that stuff to go missing. Humanitarian aid's a little different. This is one reason I'm not so much for that, because it's very hard to track that and where that goes. So, but as far as IG support, there's some debate over whether it's necessary to add yet another layer when there's already quite a bit of IG oversight. With that, okay. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.